Hello, friends. This is Gabriel. Thank you so much for being here on Exploring the Quran and the Bible. This episode is exceptional. It's one of the few topics which really brings together both the academic study of the Quran and politics and controversies today. I'll be speaking with Dr. Javad Hashmi about the way in which the life of the Prophet Muhammad and consequently the Quran is often read as though there are two completely distinct periods. There's the period in which the Prophet Muhammad was in the city of Mecca, in which he was focused just on peaceful preaching, and then his time in Medina, the Medinian period, in which he was warlike. And the way in which this intersects with politics and controversies today is because this is often assumed to be a sort of model for many Muslims in the West. So the idea is that Muhammad in Mecca, he was just kind of waiting until he got enough power so that he could accomplish his warlike ambitions, taking over by force other people. Similarly, it is said Muslims in the West are sort of just, biding their time for now, paying lip service to things like coexistence and democracy and all of that, but wait till they get power. Dr. Javad Hashmi has a way of looking again at the life of the Prophet Muhammad that challenges this sort of two-part division of his biography. And of course, if you're convinced by his arguments, that will have consequences for how you understand the way in which sort of political debates bring up this Meccan Medinan divide. We're going to speak about the end of the world. Did Muhammad think the end of the world was coming? We're going to speak in particular about two articles of Dr. Hashmi. The first is entitled The Apocalypse of Peace. That's already been published in Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations. And another one that will be published soon entitled The Proto-Apocalyptic Muhammad. As you'll soon get to hear from Dr. Javad Hashmi, let me just introduce briefly. He's a Ph.D. candidate in the study of religion, Islamic studies in particular, at Harvard University. He's also a former fellow of medical ethics at Harvard, and he is still today a practicing emergency physician. His doctoral dissertation and his publications focus particularly on the ethics of war and peace in the Quran. Thank you for being here. Please subscribe. Please like this video. I think you're going to enjoy this. Dr. Javad Hashmi, some scholars of the Quran say Muhammad was peaceful in Mecca but became warlike in Medina. What's your response to that?
Yeah, thanks so much, Professor Reynolds. And I think you can call me Javad, I'll call you Gabriel if that's okay. But I think it's undeniable that there is a shift from Mecca to Medina, from what may be called pacifism or quietism in Mecca to justified warfare in Medina. The question, I think, is what is the cause of that? And I think a popular reason that's given is something that is akin to what we could call strategic or opportunistic pacifism, which is kind of the idea that right now we don't have power and we'll wait till we have power and then we'll assert ourselves. I think it's that idea that I wish to counter, and we can talk more about that. But I don't think that that's supported in the Meccan Qur'an itself.
Well, you're the person, Javad, to speak about this topic with. There's a number of really groundbreaking articles that are coming out that you've written, engaging with some of the more controversial theses out there about the origins of Islam, also war and peace in early Islam. In the second article, you speak, in the title is The Imminence of Yahweh's Day. A lot to be said there, but I want to jump to this sort of description of God coming in the clouds, an image that you mentioned in the article that is found in the Hebrew Bible Old Testament. And it seems to be there in the Quran as well. Quran chapter 2, verse 210, so by tradition, early Medinan verse. Do they wait, but that God should come to them in canopies of clouds and the angels as well? You refer, I think, to a section in Quran 89, when the earth is leveled, pounded and pulverized, and your Lord comes with the angels, rank upon rank. جَاءَ رَبُّكَ وَالْمَلَكُ صَفًّا صَفًّا. That day, none punishes as he punishes. You're saying that this has a long history, this concept we find in the Quran, in the Bible. Could you explain a little bit what the day of Yahweh is, and then how the Quran is engaging with it.
Yeah, and this is kind of an unexpected discovery, in the sense discovery for myself. I mean, because it conflicts with like traditional Islamic theology of, God shouldn't be descending in the heavens. He's above in Salafi or Hanbali theology. He's above the heavens, outside of the universe, or in the more common understanding, those two are completely different. God doesn't have spatial direction at all. But this was just my attempt at reading the text and seeing where it takes me. And so I hope that shows in my writing, that I'm just trying to take the text and see where it goes. And that's where I saw that not only is the end imminent in the Meccan Qur'an, there's also this idea of God and his angels coming on clouds to usher in judgments. And that kind of got me looking. There was also this Ayam Allah that's mentioned, or the days of God, which got me thinking about looking at a similar trajectory in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And that's kind of the connection that I'm drawing. So I think that there's this day of Yahweh tradition that starts in the Hebrew Bible. The New Testament picks it up as the day of the Lord. And that's the idea of Jesus coming, or the Son of Man, coming on clouds. And this whole thing, by the way, is also rooted in ancient Near Eastern ideas of Baal coming on as a cloud rider. And so there's this idea that's being picked up from the ancient Near East. It's in the Hebrew Bible. It develops in the New Testament. And then I see it in the Quran as well, which I was kind of surprised to see. And so, yes, there's this idea that God and his angels will appear on the clouds. Now, there's also a verse where God is replaced with Amr, or the command of God, where there's a debate amongst Western scholars about whether that's a hypostasis or not. And that I had to even figure out, what does that even mean? And I'm not even sure.
Because there's the
I'm not even
Aramaic
sure if I
word.
know.
Yeah, as you note in the article, there's the Aramaic word memra, which could mean word, but it seems to be cognate with amar. It gets complicated. So, yeah. I mean, this sort of imagery, it could just be part of the exhortation, right? The point is not necessarily to describe exactly what's happening. The point is to inculcate sort of fear and consequently repentance and belief in the audience. What do you think about that?
I think it's possible, and that's also an explanation given for the imminent eschatology of the Meccan corpus, that it's mostly meant to be rhetorical and homiletic. I
When the
think that's
Quran says the hour has drawn near, that could be just a sort of exhortation.
It could be, and Zishan Ghaffar has argued this in a very compelling way. I'm not convinced completely, but I think if you want to read someone who presents that in a very compelling way, I think his work is to look at, and you actually interviewed him on this previously. But my issue, and Andrew O'Connor has written on this as well, and Andrew O'Connor argues that, look, the Quran is just taking part in this literary tradition in which this sort of rhetoric is used. But the problem, I think, is, number one, is I'm not convinced that in that Syriac Christian tradition that it was just used in a rhetorical way. I'm not convinced of that, number one. Number two is that tradition, even if we use that argument, that tradition didn't exist in pre-Islamic Arabia. So when the Quran is bringing this up, I think it's new for them. I mean, they didn't believe in the last day. The eschatology is the part that they disbelieved in. They mocked the Prophet for his belief that the end is imminent, it's coming. And the Prophet didn't respond. The Quran doesn't respond that, this is just rhetorical. It's like, no, the end, it really is here.
We are waiting too. Yes.
Yes, exactly. So I think it's harder to argue that it's just all rhetorical. I think there is a rhetorical aspect. And so, and this is tough for people, modern people, I think, is that it's like, okay, when a story is being told in the Quran or in the Bible, is it meant to be taken as literal history or not? Well, I think it's literal and non-literal. There's an element of both in it. Their relationship with history is different. Then for us, it's either it happened or it didn't happen. But I try to bring up an example that we can relate to even in the modern period. So it's like the environmental apocalypse that's supposed to come upon us. There's some prediction about like when the temperature will rise like 1.5 degrees or and that's there's like a clock in New York City, I think. I'm forgetting the details. I have it in my article, but that there's a prediction of the end there. Now, if it ends up happening, which is likely, that the end doesn't actually happen when they predicted it, does that mean that those people are falsified? And does it mean that they were wrong about their prediction? Does it mean that they were, and if not, does it mean that they were being completely non-literal? I think the answer to all those questions is all no.
Trying to get a bill passed or something in Washington or whatever.
Yeah, I think they do believe that the literal climatic end is coming. They're putting a time on it for rhetorical purpose, but they still do believe it's imminent. And if that time comes and it doesn't really happen, that doesn't disprove them either, because they believe in some deeper sense that it's true that we need to take care of the environment. And that's the real... Yeah, sorry, I'm rambling.
No, I want to read from the section of your articles. This is, at least in the version I have, the pagination may be different when it comes out with their song. Anyway, it's towards the end of the article. You write, the image of Muhammad as an apocalyptic prophet or as a proto-apocalyptic prophet, as I have put it, maybe you have to explain that, we haven't gotten there, may be jarring to modern sensibilities, yet the truth is that such a worldview is not as alien to us as it initially seems. Today, climate change activists alert us of an impending environmental catastrophe. If humanity fails to radically alter its behavior, they warn of a cataclysmic series of events that could render life on Earth increasingly unsustainable or even bring about the end of human civilization as we know it. Anyway, it goes on to pose the question of, should we not take that seriously? Is that just theater, basically? Or I don't know if you want to keep going or add something to that reflection.
Yeah, so that's where I think that when the Quran is saying that the end is imminent, I do think we should take it in somewhat in a literal sense, but also accept that there's a rhetorical aspect to it too. And it's not one or the other. And that's kind of the middle ground that I'm trying to take. And it's, yes, the Quranic author does believe the end is imminent, but there's an element of eschatological uncertainty in the Quran, and that's based on a certain, I forget what the exact word that I use is, but there's a sort of agnosticism in the Quran that, or epistemic humility is really the word, I guess.
How can there be, you use this phrase, eschatological uncertainty. How can that go along with places where the Quran says things like, Inna sa'ata atiya la reba fiha? The hour is coming. There is no doubt about it. That seems to be certainty, not uncertainty.
Yeah, so there's certainty about the fact that the hour is coming, but there's uncertainty about whether or not it's near or far. And that's evident in certain verses that explicitly say that. Now, there are other verses that say, no, it is near. Like you see it as far, we see it as near. How do you reconcile this? Are we going to say that it's just contradictory? Maybe. But I think it's really just rhetorical emphasis. So that on that, I'm siding with Ghaffar, Sinai, O'Connor, who are saying that there's this rhetorical aspect. But I'm not going as far as them as saying that that means that it's not literal at all. And another analogy that I give, so there's the environmental analogy. The other analogy that I give is it's just a South Asian mom who's saying, you're going to fail this exam. You're going to fail it. You're going to fail it. You're not studying. You're going to fail. All right. Now, does that mom, she's predicting that you're going to fail. But does she really mean that you're not going to fail?
If you're playing video games
actually,
instead of
exactly.
reading whatever.
You're being heedless towards the exam. And I think she really does mean it, that you're going to fail. Her fear is that you're going to fail, but it's a fear. It's not a certainty. But she needs to present it to you as a certainty so that you change your behavior. But once you change your behavior, that invalidates your mom's threat, which is what she wants to begin with.
So, okay, Javad, I want to ask about some of these big kind of controversies that come up a lot, not only in academic discourse, but also in in the US, but generally sort of public discourse on the internet about Islam. So one of these is, what you alluded to, namely that, this accusation more or less that Muhammad was basically biding his time in Mecca and waiting to get the political power he needed to sort of advance on these aggressive military campaigns. So, we shouldn't really see the peaceful patience of the Prophet in Mecca as sort of a virtue at all. Sometimes this is connected to discourse in the US where people say, well, this is actually the case for Muslims in the US, Muslim Americans. They might say we love democracy and coexistence and all that now, but this is a form of dissimulation or taqiyya. Wait till they get power and see what happens, that kind of stuff. So, major topics, obviously, with political and social implications, but where would you start addressing that?
Yeah, so I would first tease out the historical question, and that's kind of like a fact. You could kind of say that we're looking for historical facts versus a value judgment that we're going to make. So first, I think we should approach it as purely from a historical or historian's perspective, and then we can take a more theological, put our theological hat on, so to speak.
Right.
I would say from a historical perspective, we look at the sources and we have to make a judgment from the sources themselves. And I would kind of compare it to kind of this way. If we look at certain Salafi or Wahhabi scholars today, you can actually look at their work and see them endorsing specifically this kind of doctrine of strategic pacifism or opportunistic pacifism, where it will specifically say that we are not in power right now, and so we need to follow the Meccan understanding. But once we get in power, then the Medinian phase will come in, and that's when we can do warfare, and a very aggressive form of warfare at that. So we don't need to read their minds or look into their minds. They explicitly say that we're weak right now, and that's the reason why we're not going to resort to warfare. So the question really before us is, if we look at the Meccan corpus of the Qur'an, do we see that sort of argumentation being made, that right now believers are weak, we need to bide our time and then act? I don't find that in the Meccan corpus. So instead, what I find in the Meccan corpus is the idea that God's judgment is imminent, God's intervention in the world. And because of that, we ourselves don't need to take up arms because God will soon intervene in the world. And that is the reason why it endorses pacifism. So that's following a paradigm called eschatological pacifism. And that's really what my article in my first article that's out is about.
So just to break down that phrase of eschatological pacifism. So eschatology generally, as you explain in your work, is the last things, the end times, but in particular the day of judgment and divine judgment, sorting people out based on their virtues and their vices. So that God repeatedly says in the Meccan Qur'an, I'm the one who will sort of sort things out, suggests that, at least at a surface reading, as you say, the Prophet, he wasn't saying to his followers, listen, we just got to kind of deal with this moment of where we don't have political power, but we're going to get it. And then once we get it, then we can implement our plans. I think in a way, the people make that accusation. They sort of suspect that in regard to the Quran, well, the Prophet was, in fact, not showing his cards. That he even to his followers, he wasn't explaining the situation, but he had this larger plan, or these accidents of what happened when he was invited to Medina sort of changed his mind, and at that moment he seized upon the opportunity to political power. Seems, I don't know, far-fetched, right? Because how does everyone agree at once to not actually say what their agenda is? I don't know if you want to follow up on that. I did want to speak about sort of the opposite idea about Mecca. Do you want to follow up on what I just said in regard to Muhammad and the accusations of secrecy and all of that?
Sure. So from my reading of the Meccan corpus, I get the sense And this is not what I thought growing up as a Muslim, and so it was quite shocking to me when I actually read it with those kind of lenses on. But I get the sense from the Meccan corpus that the Quranic author believes that the end is imminent. So it's not this distant, far away, hazy future day of judgment, but it's imminent. It's anytime. It's around the corner. And I believe that that's a genuine belief that is coming through, or we have no reason to think otherwise. And that if the author does have that viewpoint in mind, there is no, we are going to then get power because the end is imminent. That's how the rescue of the believers is going to happen. God and his angels are going to appear on the, on clouds and come and enact judgment. So that's where I think that this idea that he was just biding his time, waiting for power, I disagree with that. I don't think the Meccan corpus supports that. Now, once he does, once there's the shift to Medina, there's definitely a shift in context, and then the eschatology reconfigures itself. And we can talk about that. So I do think that context influences
Right.
viewpoints. I'm not disagreeing with that. What I really wanted to do in my article is focus on the Meccan Qur'an and just sit with it, not read it. Like what happened? What would we do if like the prophet had, let's say, been killed or died before Medina? That's how I kind of wanted to approach it.
And
That
all you had was the Meccan Quran in
all
that
I had
hypothetical.
was that, yes. So I can't predict the future because I feel like we read back, and the tradition definitely does this. The tradition reads back the entire Islamic tradition and this kind of triumphalist narrative. But I wanted to approach it like, what if he hadn't had success? How would we then read the Meccan Quran? So read it on its own terms and sit with it. That's what I wanted to do.
So the first article that we've been alluding to these two articles. The first is entitled "The Apocalypse of Peace." So that beginning of the title is very important. Eschatological pacifism, a phrase you've already mentioned, Jafad, in the Meccan Qur'an. So this is published, already available online in Islam and Christian Muslim relations. You use that phrase, eschatological pacifism, but also you address sort of the history of models for the emergence of Islam, which sort of depend on apocalypticism. Could we kind of start with that kind of background? So in this whole period, sometimes called late antiquity, and maybe even starting with the Jesus movement, so the emergence and origins of Christianity. Lots of people are fascinated with apocalypticism, see this as sort of a major element throughout late antiquity, and then argue that early Islam is sort of just participating in this enthusiasm. Everyone seemed to think the end of the world was coming. It's just around the corner. It's going to come. So maybe if you could sort of set this scene in regard to late antique apocalypticism and how the Quran engages with that.
Yeah. So first, I think the issue is terminology, definitions. And I've actually shifted subtly between my first and my second article, to be honest. I was initially convinced that the Meccan Quran is very apocalyptic. But now I've kind of thought what the definition of apocalyptic is. And so I think the Meccan Quran embraces imminentism or eschatological imminentism of like the end is near, but I'm no longer convinced that that's sufficient to call something apocalyptic. But based on what your question is, yes, apocalypticism was definitely a major theme in late antiquity, in the centuries prior to Islam and into Islam. And I think that definitely has an impact on the Quran itself. So Stephen Shoemaker has really drawn that out very nicely in his book Apocalypse of Empire. But I am arguing and that's quite, my article is like a play on his book title. It's called Apocalypse of Peace. Because his argument is that there was this militant imperial eschatology that the Quran kind of embraces, where because the end is near, we need to kind of usher in that end time with our military conquests. I actually think the Quran goes in the opposite direction, and I think there's a long tradition of that as well that the Quran can draw from, where because the end is imminent, actually at this point in the Meccan Quran, we don't need to do anything because God is going to do it. And that's where the eschatological pacifism comes. So in my article, I try to trace this tradition of eschatological pacifism, which has its roots in kind of the ancient Near East. It's also evident in the Hebrew Bible, but it's really developed in the New Testament and then also by the early church. And so that's the trajectory that I kind of see, and I try to draw that connection.
So some of the arguments that Shoemaker advances in Apocalypse of Empire are connected specifically to ideology in the Byzantine Empire, particularly in the time of Justinian in the 6th century, then Heraclius in the early 7th century. And as you said, the idea was get things ready for the return of Christ by spreading his kingdom on earth, like actually politically through military conquest, establishing that kingdom so things are ready for the return of Christ. And in some ways, I think it's not an intuitive argument, because folks might think, if Christ is coming to set things right anyway, then why, what's the point? Just, be patient. And in a way, that's something that comes up in your argument for early Islam. But in fact, there is a tradition in this Byzantine context of folks justifying or glorifying Byzantine military adventures by speaking of that being kind of the last moment before the return of Christ. Suda Methodius, for example, that text is kind of shaped around that idea. Your argument is, on the contrary, that in this sort of way that this idea of apocalypticism manifests in the Meccan Qur'an, the sort of central theme is patience. Be patient. The day is coming soon. So trust in God. Live a virtuous life and trust that God will sort things out. But especially patience, right? Could you speak about that topic, like in Arabic, Sabar, why you see this as so central to the Meccan Qur'an?
Yeah. And before I do, I would say that, so yes, I think both threads definitely exist. And so I don't see it as far-fetched to have thought initially that maybe the Quran is embracing this kind of apocalyptic sentiment, which is then paralleled by this kind of go out and conquer the world. And that might be present in post-Muhammadan Islam and early Islam, and it probably is. I haven't studied it in depth, but I think just on face value, it seems like it's possible. But the thing is about in the Quran, the thing that I felt like Shoemaker's argument is not convincing is because the imminent eschatology is primarily in the Meccan corpus, whereas the war-related passages are in the Medinian corpus.
Right.
And so we really have to explain why are they in two different corpora.
Yeah.
Right? So it doesn't seem, and he admits this in his writing, that there's no clear connection between this imminent eschatology and warfare. It's not like it says go conquer up until the hour it's imminent. It's actually the opposite. So my understanding then is that the imminent eschatology is strongest in the Meccan Qur'an, and that's where patient endurance is being advised, not warfare. And that's the word sabar. I think that's a major theme of the Meccan Qur'an. It's also in the Medinian, but it's definitely a major theme in the Meccan Qur'an. And I link that word, I think that's connected to this kind of Christian influence of going back to the New Testament. So there's a Greek word, I'm probably going to butcher it, but hupomone, which is basically patient endurance. And I think the connection is through Syriac. So there's the Syriac word Sabar, and I think that is then reflected in the Quran in Sabara. And I try to establish that link. Now, Sabar as a concept did exist in pre-Islamic Arabia, but it didn't have that eschatological component to it. And I think that that's what the Quran is then aligning it with.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's interesting to see how my sense of speaking with Muslim friends about their own sort of spirituality, that the concept of sabr comes up a lot. I don't know, I'm a non-Muslim, so it's not as though I have sort of particular insight or authoritative insight into the principal or key concepts in Muslim spirituality. But I don't know, it seems like that is a major way in which Muslims speak about navigating the difficulties of life and how you should respond to misfortune, that sort of thing. Because sometimes people say, well, it's the Medinian Qur'an that sort of abrogates the Meccan Qur'an. The sort of definitive Islam is Medinian Islam. But I don't know if you have a thought on that. Obviously, in your second article, you have this 3 phases in which you speak about after the conquest of Mecca, somewhere around 630. There's sort of a final phase in which even sort of the Medinian phase is maybe not superseded, but develops into something more definitive. Why shouldn't the Meccan Qur'an be as important as the Medina Qur'an?
Yeah. And before I answer that, I wanted to pick up on another thread that you were mentioning, which is, I think that even though we often think of sabr related to patience and enduring like the hardships of the world, one aspect that I feel like emphasizing, which I don't think is emphasized, whether it's in Muslim or non-Muslim circles, is that aspect of sabr that's related to interreligious relations, especially if you're feeling persecuted or being persecuted. There is that aspect of sabr as a benevolent response back, basically. So growing up, you hear this like, oh, in Christianity, you have this idea of turning the other cheek, but we really believe in, if somebody slaps you, slap them back, that's what I'm trying to push back against. And I'm saying that no.
Like, oh, but Muslims would say, no, fight back.
Yes, exactly. So I wanted to really stress that no, in the Meccan Qur'an, there's this strong embrace of this New Testament ethic of non-retaliation, responding back with something better. And so that's evident in the Qur'an, and that's through the word sabr. And I think if we can recapture that, and then this is where this is not in my article, but so just from a historical standpoint, I'm looking at that. But from a practical theological standpoint, I do think maybe we as Muslims should stress this aspect more and understand that valence of interreligious relations through sabr, which is basically about enduring people who have disagreement with you religiously, who may even be persecuting you or harming you, but there's that kind of tolerance that you should show toward them. And that's based on your faith in that God will sort things out in the end. So that's number one. Number two is to answer your question about, yes, I do think that historically there has been this emphasis of the Medinan period over the Meccan. And there's even the Meccan period is read through the Medinan. So there's this triumphalist kind of narrative that's used and then applied to the Meccan period. I tried to show that in my article by an interesting anecdote about when the Prophet is being abused by Abu Jahl, and he's not responding back. And in the Sirah, it almost appears as if it's a sign of weakness that the Prophet is not responding. And that is kind of rectified by the Prophet's uncle, Hamza, coming and really strongly responding to Abu Jahl, and even
with his bow, right, striking
with his bow, right? Yes, and he hits Abu Jahl across the face. And interestingly enough, in the narrative, it's actually Abu Jahl. His people come to respond back with violence, and it's Abu Jahl who says, "No, leave him alone." And I found that really kind of interesting because the Sirah narrator is kind of praising Hamza for his response, not really the Prophet for his non-response. And ironically, it's Abu Jahl, the father of this Jahl, ignorance, not even ignorance, it's like crudeness, like, barbarism almost, who's actually embodying the Quranic ethic of this hilm, this kind of non-response, de-escalation. And so I find that ironic. So it's the later tradition which reads the Meccan period through that triumphalism that they see in the Medinian period, that I was trying to kind of get away from. So that's why I try to focus only. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to jump in, Javad. Just wanted, you mentioned this word hilm, usually in English letters, Hilm. Can you explain that word, what it means, how it's connected to sabr?
Yeah, it's basically the opposite of jahl, which is kind of this rude, barbaric kind of responses that people have. I would say the best characterization of jahl is like when people hear the Prophet being insulted or cartoons being made, and then they respond with all this anger. to me, that's like the epitome of jahl. And hilm is the opposite. And jahl was valued in pre-Islamic Arabia amongst young warriors. That's how you would defend your tribe. But they also had in pre-Islamic Arabia, they also had an emphasis on hilm, which was kind of gentility or a peaceful, wise response, a
Almost
sober-minded
as a sign of
response.
strength, like someone who actually has a strong character is not irascible, is not easily angered. And
Exactly, and that would be the kind of characteristic you'd want in a tribal chieftain,
Mhm.
who would make sure that the young warriors are not throwing the tribe into a destructive war that will just be an existential threat to them.
Mhm.
So I think both elements existed in the pre-Islamic period, but the Quran is really trying to focus on the hilm aspect and get rid of the jahal aspect.
I was
And
thinking,
so
please go ahead.
and so that is the element the Quran is trying to focus on. But I think that is kind of missing in some of the later traditions' kind of viewing of that Meccan period, because that's seen as weakness. Like, why is the prophet
Yes,
not responding?
yes.
Um,
In a context maybe where the seerah is being written, there's worldwide sort of global conflicts between great empires, and also within Islam, there's sort of competition between different ways of statecraft and all of that. Yeah, I was thinking about the story of Abu Bakr and Omar at the Prophet's death in this context about hilm, about this word hilm, where Omar sort of denies that the Prophet is gone forever, that insists he's going to come back as Moses came back, and then Abu Bakr seems to be presented at least as a model of sort of of calm, of reflection, discernment, stability. He sort of seems to play that role out. Also, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but also let me throw in here this idea. You sometimes see among reformers that the sort of first step towards reform is disrupting the notion of sort of the earlier, that is the Meccan material, being abrogated by the Medinian material. And in a sense, I mean, the Quran does speak about God abrogating, so nasakha, right? And then you have this idea of nasikh and mansukh, abrogating and abrogated. So I guess there is Quranic material to advance a sort of view of Medina replacing Mecca. But also, I mean, there's nothing really explicit about that. I mean, the Meccan part is still for Muslims, the Word of God. So, I mean, maybe the most famous, at least, non-Muslim scholars of Islam, we often hear in this context about Mahmoud Muhammad Taha, the Sudanese reformer who was eventually executed basically for, I don't know if it was bid'ah or whatever, disrupting Islam. But he basically held that, the Meccan period is sort of the fullness of the virtues of Islam, and then Medina was just, based on the circumstances the community found itself in. So, I mean, yeah, what are your comments on this notion that the first step to reform, or at least one can defend the idea that Mecca is just important as Medina?
yeah. So first, let me approach that from a historian's perspective, and
Mm-hmm.
then as a liberal theologian after that. So, from a historical perspective, I would say that one of the interventions that I'm trying to make, and I wish I had wrote it explicitly in my second article, but I'm actually arguing that we should, how we have Meccan and Medinian Quran, and in the Meccan we have the early, middle, and late Meccan periods.
Mm-hmm.
That's often how we divide it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually trying
In
to
Western
argue
scholarship, right?
in Western scholarship, yes.
Right.
I'm actually arguing that we should probably also divide it into first Meccan and second Meccan, so that just like there's first Maccabee, second Maccabee. So this is kind of something that I want to push as the first Meccan and second Meccan, where the first Meccan period is that early, middle, and late, and then there's the Medinian period, and then there's a second Meccan period. That's what I want to argue.
After
And
the
so
conquest, at the end of the
after the
Prophet's life.
conquest of Mecca, yes, and so and this is where my second article comes into play, my Dur Islam article, in which I'm arguing against the two-stage eschatology thesis. And there's a few scholars who have written on this, Walid Saleh has a little bit about it, but it's really David Marshall and Mark Dury
Mark
who
Dury.
have written on this two-stage eschatology. I'm arguing that there's actually 3 stages in the Quran's eschatology. The first stage is the Meccan Qur'an, which, as I've argued, embraces kind of this imminent eschatology. The end is near. And because of that, there's this pacifism associated with it. That's the first phase. So that's first Mecca. Then there's the Medinian period, in which there's a partial reconfiguration. And this is one of the points that I try to raise, that it's not a full reconfiguration. There are still verses in the Medinian period that say that the end is imminent. It's a lot less, but it's still there. And so the idea of the 2-stage eschatology thesis is that, well, the end didn't come, God's judgment didn't come, so now Muhammad and the believers are going to enact God's punishment and judgment on the unbelievers and even destroy them completely.
Be the rod of God's wrath.
Yes, be the rod of God's wrath. Exactly. And I think there's an element of truth to that, except I don't think the punishment is for their unbelief. I think it's for them persecuting the believers, and that's my 3rd article on fight them until there is no religious persecution or fitna. But leaving that aside, I think the full eschatological reconfiguration takes place after the conquest of Mecca, or with the conquest of Mecca, and that's where the second Meccan phase comes into play that I think we should emphasize. And there's only probably a handful of surahs that we can place in there. But I think if we look at that, we see that the Prophet actually forgives the people of Mecca, his former foes. There's a general amnesty. And the Quran sees the embrace of Islam, or the deen, God's religion. Religion is probably the wrong word. God's worship, as
I hear Mohsen Godarzi there.
Yeah, Mohsen was in my ear. He was like, "Don't dare say the word religion." But with that, the eschatological threat recedes, basically. And this is where there's a scholarly term, avertive apocalypticism. I actually, in my second article, I think avertive eschatology is probably a better word to use. But it's the idea that, yes, God's judgment is imminent. He's going to destroy either the society or the world unless they repent. And so it's a conditional eschatology. And so I really wanted to highlight that aspect, and it's in the Bible as well. So the people of Jonah, they repent and they mend their ways, and so there's this verse that says that therefore God didn't punish them.
Yeah, Jonah literally, in the biblical version, literally predicts the end. So 40 days more, and then 40 days more, Jonah in Nineveh will be destroyed, right? It's not, he doesn't say repent or, so he simply says it's going to happen. And then, of course, it doesn't happen because God sees the repentance.
And so the Quran actually picks up that story and that element. And I think that's very significant. And the Quran then even addresses the Meccans and says, basically it's pleading with them almost and saying, why didn't any town other than the people of Jonah repent? But the idea there is that you should do that. And there are also verses that say God will not punish them while they're reforming themselves. God will not punish them while you are amongst them, talking to Muhammad. Now, part of that could be that God's judgment didn't come, and so that has to be explained somehow in the Medinian period. But I also think that there's a genuine aspect of the Prophet wanting his people to reform. And so that is where I'm trying to take a middle ground approach between, there's some scholars who say that the Quran predicts the imminent end of the world and that the Prophet was wrong about that.
Yes.
And then there's other scholars who take a completely anti-apocalyptic viewpoint, which says that, no, it's all rhetorical. Right. The end is going to happen eventually. It's stressed as being imminent only to really say that it's going to happen. I'm trying to go right in the middle and say that, no, the end is imminent, and it really is, but it's a conditional imminent end, and so you can avert it. And I think that that's what happens in the third phase of the Quran. And that goes back to your original question, which I know I just rambled a lot. But I think Muslims, instead of reading the Meccan Qur'an through the Medinian, should actually read if they're going to, and now we're talking theologically speaking,
Hmm.
you should read the whole Quran. If you're going to, based on chronology, you should look at that last phase of the Quran in which it's a return to general amnesty and mercy. And so
Yes.
it's not like all
Yes.
of that was abrogated. In
Good.
fact, I think the Quran tries to return not to a fully pacifist viewpoint, but there is an element of that. When the Prophet enters Mecca,
Hmm.
he could have slaughtered his opponents. That is a very common thing in pre-modern societies. You vanquished an enemy, now you can put people to the slaughter.
Hmm.
But there is not that. Instead, there's forgiveness and
Hmm.
mercy. And so, from a theological standpoint, I think that's
Hmm.
a thread that we can really pick up on.
Okay, so I have lots of things on my mind, but first I want to make sure I mention the second, and I'll mention the third article too. Again, all the links are in the description below, but the second article we've been alluding to, we've already said it's in Dare Islam, but the full title is The Proto-Apocalyptic Muhammad, the Imminence of Yahweh's Day in the Qur'an's Three-Stage Eschatology. So some things to explain there, which we'll circle back to, like how does Yahweh, an allusion to Hebrew Bible, Old Testament there, enter into all this. We'll get there. Also, there's the fitna fighting verses. When does Quranic warfare cease? So that will be coming out in JICSA, the Journal of the International Quranic Studies Association. I want to follow up about sort of your approach to this as a theologian. I mean, maybe you could just speak generally about interpreting the Quran theologically. I mean, we've raised this question of maybe the standard or dominant idea that the Medinan paradigm is seen as abrogating the Meccan, or at least being sort of, the fullness of Islam. I mean, from a theological point of view, uh, you know, how do you approach the text then? If you sort of say that's not the right way to go, the Meccan is still important. Um, how do you sort through sort of a method in which you have maybe primary elements of the Quran? How do you identify them? On what basis?
That's
Is
a
that okay? It's a
really
huge
difficult
question,
question.
Javad. Sorry,
Yeah.
sorry.
I wasn't prepared for that one, so I'm not sure if, and I would
It's
preface
just
it
you hear
with,
people. Sorry, I'll clarify if it'll help. But you hear people
yeah,
say like, no, there are sort of these major themes. I mean, Fazl Rahman's book, Major Themes of the Quran. There are major themes around which you can orient a believer's reading of the Quran. It doesn't have to be, what the ulama in this or that day said about how to read the Quran.
yeah. So I would first say that, I didn't even finish my PhD yet, so I'm very aware that I'm a very junior scholar, and at this point in my career, I'm really trying to focus on the historical work,
Hmm.
and leave the theology for later in my career, primarily. So I'll say that's number one. I'm trying to approach it as a historian. Now, of course, my subjectivities do come into play, and there's this thing about, Jesus scholars will see a mirror of themselves in what they reconstruct.
Hmm. Hmm.
There's definitely some of that going on that I can definitely admit to. But ultimately, from a historical standpoint, I think you have to look at the evidence and the data and see, are you bringing strong arguments? And from that, I hope that my scholarship will stand on its own 2 feet. Now, from a theological perspective, I think it really depends on what your theory of revelation is. What are you prioritizing, your methodology?
Hmm.
Um, and from that standpoint, the question is, do you think what's the balance between reason and revelation, I think. And I think I am definitely at that point where I think that reason should be prioritized, so that when we're approaching the text, we do understand that we're bringing something to the text, and we're aware of that. And I think that's okay. But I think anytime that you look at a text, or if you're trying to reconstruct early history, because that's an aspect of religion as well. Like, how do you see the founding moment of Islam? That's why this matters a lot for Muslims. It's a religious endeavor as well.
Hmm.
Um, but we write our own history. So we write the narrative of the Prophet, and we can focus on the triumphalist warlike aspects if we want, or we can focus on the peace aspects. Um, and so, if I'm looking at the Christian tradition, I do think especially in the modern period, there's a shift towards this more kind of liberal viewing of of Jesus, and I think that's perfectly fine. I think that's what Muslims should do as well, and we should, tell the story of the prophet and stress those aspects that resonate with us. And I think that's just a good way of doing it. So I don't think it's completely. It doesn't mean that we lie or we stretch the truth. It's just that we focus, and that's where I think this three-stage eschatology can be useful. Of not reading the Meccan through the Medinian, but really in this kind of three-stage eschatology that does return back to that Meccan ethic.
Second period in Mecca after the conquest. I mean, in terms of theology and all of that, day one usually in my intro to theology class at Notre Dame is basically on reason and revelation. Speaking with students about what is philosophy, what is theology, what are the differences. Obviously a believer is responding to what he or she thinks or understands God to have shared with them, and so you're not just sorting things out, as you want them to be, but still, theology is more than just, reciting the words of the Bible or the Qur'an. And so, theologically, most people would say you can have a sense of what is good, what is just, what is beautiful, and have those as sort of at least important principles that you take with you into the reading of the text. I think that's really important to remember. And I think there's times where non-Muslim observers of Islam, assume that that's not part of Islamic discourse. Muslims haven't gotten there yet. But in fact, many thinkers in the classical period. I mean, you refer to Fakhruddin Arazi in the second article in some of his creative interpretations, but especially in the modern period, those notions of reason are really, really important. Yeah, I mean, I guess I want to ask generally then about language in the Quran and, I mean, any scripture, right? Or really any book, doesn't have to be a holy book. For example, you refer to earlier stories of earlier peoples who were punished. So, the Quran tells these famous stories, often called in Western scholarship the punishment stories. I think you even give the German for it in the article, because it was German scholars who penned that or who coined that phrase. But then you also note that those serve basically to, maybe you'll correct me on this, but I think you're saying that they serve to act as warnings of the day of judgment itself. So the final cataclysmic day of judgment. Yeah, so I guess it's in the same place where, I mean, the language is true in one sense, but you're saying that maybe like the actual story of, the people of this or that prophet who were destroyed by an earthquake or a blast or something, it's not like true in the historical sense that modern people might think of it.
Yeah, well, and this is stuff that I've talked about, I think, on our previous interview about how literally do we take these stories. Let me be very clear. I do think that the Quran intends its immediate audience to take those as literally true, in the sense of as close as we can get to. Historically, yeah. Maybe historical is the wrong word to use, but it is true in that sense. But the question whether and the reason why the Quran needs to do that is that's what makes it imminent and applicable to its audience. That those people were destroyed, you're going to be destroyed, and that's just more rhetorically effective if you actually do believe that those things happen, and they did believe that those things happened. Now, for us contemporary readers, that's a different discussion, how we interpret those stories, especially with historical critical scholarship and what we know today. Do we take it literally? Was Jonah in a whale or a fish? That's a different story.
Preach for 950 years or live for 950
Correct.
years.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So from that perspective, I think I've moved to, of course, that no, we can't take that literally. But nonetheless, we can take the literary aspect seriously. and say that what the Quran is trying to do is something that is still applicable to us.
Yeah, I
Which
mean,
is
my
to say
intent.
that let's not be heedless about the world. Judgment will come. Take that seriously.
Yeah, and my intent was not to suggest that the Quran or the Bible is invalidated by the nature of the stories it tells, but just sort of thinking with some of the language about God coming on clouds and some of the other apocalyptic language predictions, that even when looking backwards instead of forwards, I mean, you could theologically make the case that, you know, the divine author of this text means to, uh, you know, uh, get to a certain response in the audience. You know, the point is to get you to repent and believe, so that you will be. Christian would say saved. Muslim might say get your reward, something like that. I can. This is more in the same theme, and we might have covered this a bit. But I mean, if someone does sort of take the path of this language is true in the sense of it's really God's word meant for the good of the audience, I mean, I guess the danger then is, well, can you take anything literally? I mean, like the language about Jannah, about heaven or paradise, you know, when it speaks of some of the rewards you have there, you know, is that all just symbolic? Uh, yeah, I could see someone, a more, say, conservative theologian would say, well, you know, it might be okay in the first, you know, at first, but if you keep going the way you're going, you're going to end up with nothing. You'll just be lost in a sea of ambiguity and symbolism.
Yeah. And what I'll say is that even in the Quran, there is this, I don't know about discomfort, but there's some ambiguity about whether or not it's literally God coming down. And I try to highlight that in the
Mhm.
article, that it is sometimes God is replaced by his command. And what that command is up for grabs. What does that mean? But I think it's possible that it is a divine hypostasis. So, and is that due to this kind of pre-existing debate about whether God himself will literally come down in his creation? So this ambiguity is already there in the Quran. But as far as the concern of more conservative theologians, I think they're actually right that there is that fear, and I may have reached escape velocity from that standpoint of exactly what they feared. I mean, for me, I'm at a point where I think religion is largely a man-made construct trying to understand the divine, things that are beyond us. And I'm simply comfortable with that. So, but keep in mind that this exists in our Islamic tradition. The classical Islamic philosophers, they also believe that revelation is just using symbolic language, stories, myths, legends to tell higher truths. So that exists in our tradition. And that's really kind of the direction that I've been felt forced to go, just if I wanted to stay true to my historical scholarship,
And
my
there's a
scholarship.
history in Islam, as in Christianity, and presumably in Judaism, but I don't know well, of negative theology. Like we can have the most confidence when we deny certain things of God, like God cannot be this or that. Obviously, Scripture affirms things, and so the believer would like to affirm those things along with the Quran. But then, how do you understand this or that can be complicated. Speaking of complicated things, I want to get to one final topic, which is returning back to war. I mean, we sort of started with this question of, there's a standard idea that Muhammad was peaceful in Mecca, but then, warlike in Medina. You've advanced, I think, a really convincing case that, the Mecca and Muhammad both before the Hijrah, so before 622 by the traditional date, and after the conquest of Mecca, so after 630, before his death in 632, that can be just as, or maybe even more of a standard for Muslim understandings of ethics and religion generally. But there is a tradition within Islam of not setting aside or explaining away the maghazi, Muhammad's victories, and mostly victories in war, but rather celebrating those and celebrating the great Muslim generals Tariq ibn Ziyad, who went into Spain, Mehmed II, who conquered Constantinople, and others. So, I mean, that's there too as part of the tradition, right? So, yeah, what would you say about that?
I would say that's where, from a theological perspective, I would wish to make an intervention of reassessment. That, we write, like I said, we write our own story, and I think we have hyper emphasized that triumphalist aspect, and that's where I think we should rewrite how we imagine our past,
Mm-hmm.
and focus more on the peace aspect, which is there, and it requires us to tell the story. And historians have a role in that as well, to highlight that.
Mm-hmm.
So that starts with not just the prophet's life. So even the Medinian period, how do we understand that? I think many modern Muslims now do believe that the wars were defensive, ultimately in nature. That's a historical debate. I take part in that as well. But Muslims, forgetting about the historical aspect from a confessional standpoint, are more than entitled to take that viewpoint. And then, like I said, focusing on that third eschatological phase that I'm trying to stress, which is a partial return back to that Meccan ethic
Mm-hmm.
of pacifism. And then also then looking at our Islamic tradition and stressing those aspects that are along those lines, as opposed to the wars and the battles. So we always, even the way we name our children, to be honest, the way the things we remember, we seem to focus on that triumphalism and that military triumphalism,
I mean, it's
as
not just
opposed to
Islam, though, Javad. As you know, I mean, the
sure, yeah,
Hollywood loves blockbusters with this or that, military hero, whether it's real or it's Game of Thrones. I mean, yeah, I mean, that's just it appeals for some reason to human nature.
yeah, and I'm definitely opposed to like viewing Islam as somehow exceptionally violent or something like that. But ultimately, I am a Muslim, and that's my tradition, and so I can only reform or help to reform my own tradition. And from that standpoint, I think, for example, I think many Muslims don't know about the South Asian Islamic tradition, where there were Mughal emperors who promoted this idea of sul-i-kul, or peace to all, abolish the jizya, equal rights for all. So sorry. I think that's an element that we should emphasize, and that's about writing our own story.
I have a million more things I wanna ask you.
I'm sorry about the phone call.
No worries. We yeah, no problem at all. Well, Javad, thank you very much for being with me. I want to repeat the titles of the articles that we've mentioned. So the first is The Apocalypse of Peace, Eschatological Pacifism in the Meccan Qur'an. That's already out. That'll be linked to below. And then the second is The Proto-Apocalyptic Muhammad, the Imminence of Yahweh's Day in the Qur'an's three-stage eschatology. That's coming out soon with Dar Islam. Anything you want to add about things you're up to these days, projects going on, next steps?
Not really. No, just trying to finish that dissertation, and the dissertation end is near, but never quite yet. Just like the end in the Quran. That's how I feel.
Well, I mean, you're also busy saving people's lives in the emergency room. So, yeah, thank you for that. And thanks for being with me, Javad. Until next time.
Thank you.